A retired Navy corpsman showed up at a Coast Guard pier with the right paperwork, the right clearance, and the quiet confidence of a man who's kept promises in worse places than this. But the young officer at the checkpoint didn't care. He looked the veteran up and down, tore his papers in half, and kicked him off the boat in front of everyone. No one stood up for him. Not at first, but when they looked up the name on that ID, that's when they started regretting it. Want to discover the shocking truth behind this veteran's identity? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from, here on Graceful Valor Stories. Let's get into it. The morning fog rolled thick across San Diego Harbor like smoke from a forgotten battlefield. Beneath it, the Coast Guard cutter sat ready, diesel engines humming low while uniformed crews moved with practiced urgency. It was drill day, the kind that tested readiness under pressure, where every detail mattered and mistakes could cost lives. The pier buzzed with controlled chaos. Sailors hauled equipment, checked manifests, and barked orders over the sound of gulls crying overhead. Radio chatter crackled through the salt air, mixing with the distant rumble of helicopters warming up at the Naval Air Station across the bay. At the security checkpoint, a man approached quietly. No fanfare, no announcement, just steady footsteps on concrete. Ever wonder what secrets a man like him could be hiding? Stay with us, the twist will change everything, here on Graceful Valor Stories. Daniel Rusk moved with a deliberate limp, but carried himself like someone who'd marched straighter than most men could dream. 68 years old, weathered hands that told stories of hard work and harder times, square jaw set with quiet determination, the kind of presence that made others instinctively straighten their backs. He wore a simple collared shirt under a canvas jacket, boots polished to a dull shine, dog tags tucked inside, just visible through a worn seam in the fabric. Over his shoulder hung a single duffel bag, worn leather handles smoothed by decades of use, the kind of bag that had seen too many deployments to count. In his other hand, a sealed manila folder containing his civilian observer authorization, cleared just last week through a regional veterans outreach program that partnered with active units for training exercises. But that paper never made it past the gate. "Whoa, hang on there," came a voice sharp with authority. Petty Officer Zane Mercer, early 30s, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, the kind of swagger that came from being average at everything but feeling superior. Anyway, he glanced at Daniel like he was looking at something that didn't belong, something that disrupted his perfectly ordered world. "You here for a tour or something, Grandpa?" Daniel didn't flinch, his voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of years spent keeping composure under pressure. "Observer for today's readiness drill. Signed through Lieutenant Rodis's program." Mercer snatched the folder without asking, flipped it open with one finger like he was handling trash, scanned the first page, and snorted. "Yeah, this isn't a museum. No spectators, especially not ones with bad hips." He smiled like he was doing the old man a favor, like he was protecting the sacred halls of military precision from civilian contamination. Then, slowly, dramatically, tore the authorization clean down the middle. Daniel's eyes didn't narrow, didn't show anger, just the deep, patient stillness of someone who'd weathered worse storms. Much worse. The kind of stillness that came from watching young men die in his arms while enemy fire rained down around them. "I'm cleared by base command," he said simply, his voice carrying no plea, no demand, just fact. Mercer laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the morning air, tossing the torn halves over his shoulder like confetti. "Not by me, and I'm the one with the checklist. You're not getting on that dock, old man. Take it up with your local VFW." A couple of junior crewmen nearby chuckled, feeding off Mercer's arrogance. One of them, barely old enough to shave, muttered under his breath, "Bet he thinks he's still in Vietnam or something." Another added, "Probably tells war stories at the diner every morning." Daniel nodded once, reached down for his duffel bag, and began walking away. He didn't argue, didn't demand, didn't raise his voice or threaten to call their commanding officer. He just accepted the humiliation with the same quiet dignity he'd carried through everything else. The same dignity that had held him together when his world fell apart on foreign soil decades ago. But across the parking lot, a military spouse with her toddler had seen the entire exchange. Sarah Martinez, wife of a deployed Marine, had brought her 3-year-old son to watch the big ships. She pulled out her phone and started recording because something about the way that old man walked away, shoulders straight despite the blow to his pride, told her this wasn't over. What none of them knew was that Daniel Rusk had started his morning the same way he always did. Slow, precise, like muscle memory from another lifetime, he stood in the soft light of his modest apartment, a one-bedroom place overlooking the harbor that he'd called home for the past 8 years. The rent was too high and the walls too thin, but it was close to the water, and the water reminded him of better days. Boots laced tight, movements deliberate, economical, no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. His left leg carrying the weight of an old war wound that never quite healed, right, but never showed weakness either. The blinds cast thin lines across a room full of shadows and history. A single cup of coffee steamed on the kitchen counter next to a laminated email confirmation for today's Observer program. He'd printed it at the library the same way he did everything else that required technology these days. Computers and smartphones belonged to a world that had moved on without him. Across the room on a wooden bench that had once belonged to his father sat an old military trunk, all drab reinforced corners, the kind they don't make anymore. He opened it carefully, the hinges protesting with a soft squeak, and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth that had once been white. Inside, a folded American flag presented to him by a grateful nation after his last deployment. A brass Zippo with initials worn smooth, not his initials, but those of a young SEAL who'd given it to him the night before a mission went sideways. And a torn field patch bearing the Navy corpsman's insignia, stained with sweat and something darker, something that laundry could never quite wash away. Underneath lay a photograph of a much younger Daniel, 26 years old, gear-slung, dust-covered, grinning, even as smoke twisted behind him from a compound they just cleared, his arm around a SEAL whose name he still couldn't say out loud, whose body had come home in a flag-draped box while Daniel survived with nothing but guilt and a limp. He slipped the patch into his breast pocket close to his heart, feeling the weight of it against his chest, then closed the trunk without ceremony, the way he closed most chapters of his life, quietly, with no fanfare. This wasn't about reliving glory days. He wasn't some ghost chasing relevance or trying to recapture youth on a Coast Guard deck. Daniel had volunteered for the Observer program because of a promise. A young recruit he'd mentored through a tough patch, a kid from East LA whose older brother had been killed in Afghanistan, was now assigned to this unit. And Daniel had told him, "When you rotate home, I'll make sure the people watching your six still know how." The drive to the harbor took 25 minutes through morning traffic that moved like molasses. Daniel didn't listen to music, didn't check his phone. He didn't even own a smartphone. He just drove, hands steady on the wheel, eyes focused on the road ahead. The same focus that had kept him alive in places where focus meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. He passed familiar landmarks, the diner where he sometimes grabbed breakfast, the VA clinic where he got his prescriptions filled, the park where he fed the pigeons on Sundays. A quiet life, a simple life, the kind that didn't make headlines or demand attention, exactly the way he liked it. At the security table, Daniel waited patiently while the guard processed the person ahead of him, a contractor with a clipboard and an attitude, arguing about parking passes and access codes. When his turn came, he handed over his ID and the sealed folder with the care of someone who understood that paperwork mattered, that details saved lives. No small talk, no forced smile, just quiet presence and the expectation that competence would be met with competence. Petty Officer Mercer didn't bother hiding his smirk when he saw the graying man approach. "Let me guess," he said, not even looking at the paperwork yet. "You used to be something important, right? Came here to relive the old days?" A few younger sailors nearby snorted, feeding off their superiors' disdain. One leaning over to whisper, "Grandpa wants to ride the big boat?" Another chimed in, "Think he's gonna tell us how they did it in Nam?" Mercer held up Daniel's ID like it was counterfeit, squinting at it with exaggerated suspicion. "I don't care what this says. Civilian observers need to pass minimum physical standards. And you're walking with a limp. What happens if we need to evacuate? You gonna slow down the whole crew?" Daniel remained calm, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd explained things to panicked soldiers in the middle of firefights. "Clearance came from Navy Liaison. I'm here at their request." Mercer leaned forward, voice dripping with mockery, playing to his audience of young sailors who thought disrespect was the same as authority. "This isn't the VA rec room, Pops. You want to watch ships? There's a maritime museum 5 blocks west. They got a nice gift shop, too." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, the kind that teenage boys used to establish pecking orders. But Daniel had heard worse, much worse, from people who mattered much more. Then, deliberately, slowly, Mercer tore the authorization in half right down the middle. The sound of ripping paper cut through the morning air like a slap, letting the pieces flutter like dead leaves to the concrete. "Turn around," Mercer ordered, loud enough for everyone within 50 yards to hear. "This pier's for active personnel and approved observers. You're not either. Don't make me call someone to walk you out." Daniel nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. He picked up his duffel, adjusted the strap across his shoulder, and turned away. No dramatics, no protest, no angry words about rights or respect, or the blood he'd spilled for the uniform they were wearing. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who'd learned when to fight and when to walk away. But as he moved toward the exit, Mercer couldn't resist one final insult, his voice carrying across the dock like a challenge. "Tell your bingo club the Coast Guard's full today. Maybe try again next Veterans Day." The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, and unnecessary. None of the other guards said a word. None of them questioned the decision or suggested that maybe they should double-check the authorization. They just watched an old man walk away, carrying his dignity like armor that had been dented but never broken. What they didn't see was Lieutenant Jason Park returning from a command briefing, clipboard in hand, mind focused on the day's operations. He caught the tail end of the confrontation, Daniel walking away with measured steps, Mercer dusting off his hands like he'd cleaned up something dirty. The junior sailors still chuckling among themselves. "Hey," Park said, approaching the checkpoint with the easy authority of someone who'd earned his rank. "What just happened?" "Guy tried to slide onto the manifest," Mercer replied, not even looking up from his checklist, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. "Claimed he had clearance. Did he? Paperwork looked printed at home. Old school stuff, you know. Limped like he needed a walker. Gut check told me no." Park frowned, something nagging at the back of his mind. In his experience, gut checks were usually wrong when they involved dismissing people too quickly. "What was the name?" Mercer shrugged, flipping through his clipboard with the casual indifference of someone who'd already forgotten the encounter. Didn't bother logging it, something like Russ. Doesn't matter now. Something pinged in the back of Park's mind, deep in the back where call signs and buried briefings lived, where the names of people who'd done things that couldn't be talked about in public were filed away. He stepped past Mercer and leaned into the trash bin, fishing out the torn authorization while a few eyes followed him, curious, uncomfortable. He pulled the pieces free, smoothed them out on the checkpoint's table, and read the name. Daniel Rusk. The name hit him like a physical blow. "I know that name," he muttered, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than Mercer shouting. Then, without another word, he strode toward the ops shack. His pace wasn't frantic, but it was fast, the walk of someone who just realized that a very big mistake had been made. Inside the ops trailer, Park keyed in his credentials with fingers that moved faster than usual, bypassing standard lookup protocols and going straight into classified personnel databases. The system blinked twice, processing his clearance, then loaded with the quiet hum of a machine revealing secrets. Rusk, Daniel, HM1R. Lines of service history began to populate, units that most people had never heard of, campaigns that didn't exist in any public record. Then the words that made his stomach drop like a stone attached to JC Tier 1. SOCOM Classified Deployment Roster. Citation, Silver Star, Operation Harvest Reach. Field Corpsman, DevGru, Adjunct Medical Specialist, Combat Action Ribbon, 3. Purple Heart, 2. Park stared at the screen in growing horror. Mercer hadn't just denied some grumpy old vet hoping to tour a ship. He'd publicly humiliated a man who'd patched up Tier 1 operators in Kandahar, Fallujah, Sadr. A man whose service record lived behind red tape for reasons most people would never understand. A man who'd saved lives in places that officially didn't exist. The bio continued, each line hitting harder than the last. Medical specialist, Operation Neptune Spear, Afghanistan. Combat medic, Joint Task Force 145. Classified 47 successful extractions under fire. Classified 12 Purple Hearts prevented through field medicine. Park's hands were shaking slightly as he grabbed the secure phone, his voice tight with controlled panic. This is Lieutenant Jason Park at the Naval Pier. I've got a high-priority situation with civilian observer Daniel Rusk. He was denied access by a petty officer under my watch. I'm looking at a file marked Red Tag JC. The voice on the other end was sharp, measured, like someone who'd been expecting this call and dreading it. You're calling late, Lieutenant. Rusk's name should have been highlighted on every deck manifest in red, with a note to treat him with full honors. I wasn't informed, Park said weakly, already knowing how pathetic that sounded. You are now. Get him back on that boat and make sure he's treated with the dignity he earned bleeding for this country. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear, sir. The line went dead. Park hung up slowly, then walked out of the ops shock with a mission and a growing sense that his career might depend on the next 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Daniel sat on a weathered bench just outside the security perimeter between the parking area and the wharf. The bench was old, paint peeling, probably installed sometime in the 80s and forgotten by everyone except the seagulls that used it as a perch. His duffel rested at his feet, one hand lying across it, the other slowly turning the corner of his ID folder, an old nervous habit from years of waiting for orders that might never come, for helicopters that might not make it, for news that was usually bad. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he'd given up long ago. Around the same time, he'd stopped expecting the world to be fair. He was just heavy in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the weight of memories that never seemed to get lighter. The salt air carried the sound of seagulls and diesel engines, familiar sounds that usually brought him peace. Today, they just reminded him how far he was from where he used to belong. Not geographically, but emotionally. Once he'd been part of something bigger than himself. Now, he was just an old man who'd been turned away from a dock. Lieutenant Park approached without ceremony. No sirens, no salutes, just the slow, measured sound of boots on concrete and the weight of someone carrying bad news. Mr. Rusk, Park said gently, stopping in front of him with the careful posture of someone addressing a senior officer. We'd be honored if you'd come aboard. Daniel looked up, didn't stand. His eyes held the quiet skepticism of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easy words. Didn't seem that way earlier. No excuse, Park replied, his tone honest, direct, carrying the weight of genuine regret. You were treated with disrespect, with shame. But some of us know who you are, and we're not about to pretend we don't. Daniel studied him for a long moment, reading the man's face the way he'd once read the faces of young soldiers who claimed they could handle another patrol. Finally, slowly, he stood. Not with dramatic effort, just the quiet motion of a man who'd done this countless times before, under worse conditions, with more pain in his body and more weight on his shoulders. He picked up the duffel, adjusted the strap with the automatic precision of someone who'd carried gear across half the world, and looked Park square in the eye. Then, I'll hold you to the standard you say you live by. It wasn't a threat. It was a contract witnessed by the salt air and the crying gulls. Fair, Park said, swallowing hard. The two men walked side by side through the gate, where security now stood at attention, not because they had been ordered to, but because word had spread the way it always did on military installations when someone important was involved.
A corporal stepped forward to scan Daniel's badge again, this time with visible care, offering a respectful nod instead of a dismissive glance. Wordless acknowledgments passed from guard to guard. Not one person looked away, Now, the same men who'd laughed at Mercer's jokes 10 minutes ago suddenly found reasons to busy themselves with important tasks. By the time they reached the dock, the vessel had already updated its manifest. Daniel's name printed in bold, cleared by both Navy liaison and, according to the increasingly frantic radio chatter, Rear Admiral Lee himself. As Park motioned him up the gangway, a stiff wind kicked across the harbor. Cool, sharp, heavy with salt, and the promise of a storm somewhere out beyond the horizon. Daniel stopped just before stepping aboard. He turned back briefly, scanning the perimeter with the automatic threat assessment of someone who'd learned that danger could come from any direction, watching. Mercer stood near the equipment lockers in the distance, pretending to check a clipboard, but doing a poor job of hiding his flushed face. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced by the hunched posture of someone who just realized he'd stepped on a landmine. Daniel didn't acknowledge him, didn't glare, didn't smirk, didn't need to waste energy on petty satisfaction. Instead, he stepped onto the deck with quiet precision, and this time, no one stopped him. The deck of the Coast Guard cutter buzzed with last-minute preparations, sailors checking lines, confirming readiness codes, radio chatter crackling through the salt air like electronic nervous energy. But the moment Daniel Rusk stepped aboard, the energy shifted in a way that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with presence. A stillness settled over the space, like someone had turned down the volume on everything except what mattered. Every crew member glanced up, some subtly, some openly. The same man who'd been mocked an hour ago was now walking the gangway like he belonged there, like he'd earned his place through something more substantial than paperwork and clearances. Not rushing, not posturing, just calm, centered, like someone who knew his place even if everyone else had forgotten. Mercer stood off to the side, rigid, forced into parade rest by Lieutenant Park, who shadowed Daniel from behind with the protective posture of someone correcting a grave mistake. Park didn't speak, didn't need to. The message was clear to everyone watching: you will not touch this man again. Daniel paused near the starboard rail, resting his weathered hand on the metal edge. His eyes scanned the horizon, not admiring the view, not daydreaming about past glories, just orienting himself the way a sailor does, reading the wind, checking the swells, feeling the rhythm of the vessel beneath his feet. His balance was perfect despite his age, despite the uneven deck and sharp wind that sent spray across the bow. Two junior seamen whispered near the rope locker, their voices carrying just far enough for others to hear. Is that the guy Mercer kicked out? Yeah, but Park brought him back. What did he do? He's gotta be someone important. A bosun's mate coming up the ladder cut in low, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been in the service long enough to recognize the real thing when he saw it. That man patched up more warriors than this boat's ever held. The whisper turned to silence. Words spread fast aboard a vessel, especially when authority got reversed in real time and someone with actual credibility started talking. Daniel walked past Mercer, who stared at a non-existent point on the bulkhead like it might open and swallow him whole. Daniel didn't break stride, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge the man's existence in any way that mattered. The engine thrummed beneath the deck, a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of Daniel's breathing. Lines were cast off with practiced efficiency, and the cutter eased away from dock into open water, officially underway on a mission that had suddenly become much more complicated than a simple training exercise. But no one was watching the shoreline anymore. They were watching him.
It wasn't long before the ship's commanding officer emerged from the cabin. Captain Renee Calder, mid-50s, composed, precise, with the kind of quiet authority that never needed to raise its voice or prove itself to anyone. She scanned the deck as the cutter gained distance, taking inventory of her crew and their readiness, then made her way toward the assembled personnel. Her eyes landed on Daniel Rusk, and her face changed. A flicker of recognition that hit her like electricity, then warmth, then something close to reverence. She walked straight past the junior sailors, past the enlisted men pretending not to stare, past Mercer, who stood so still he might have been trying to disappear into the aluminum frame of the ship itself. "Mr. Rusk," Captain Calder said clearly, extending her hand with the respect usually reserved for visiting admirals. I never forgot what you did in Kandahar. Daniel turned slightly, surprised, not by the recognition, but by the personal nature of it. He met her handshake with a firm grip, the calloused hands of a man who'd worked with them for 68 years. That was a long time ago. Not to me, she smiled, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of shared understanding, of nights that were too long and losses that were too heavy. No speech, no long story, just the kind of acknowledgement that doesn't need explaining when it comes from someone who was there, who knew what the job really cost. Calder stepped back and turned to the assembled crew, who watched like they were witnessing something sacred, something that would be talked about in birthing compartments for years to come. Mr. Rusk, she said, voice carrying across the deck with the clear authority of command. You're not here as a guest. You're here as someone who's earned a place. Anyone who doubts that? Her eyes settled on Mercer like a targeting laser. We'll discuss when we dock. Mercer swallowed hard, gave a weak "yes, ma'am," and shuffled away. His arrogance finally stripped under the weight of public accountability and the growing realization that his career might not survive the day. Captain Calder turned back to Daniel, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. Anything you need during this ride, you come to me direct. Daniel nodded once, the gesture carrying more weight than a salute. Appreciate it. She hesitated just for a breath, her eyes holding something that looked like curiosity mixed with respect. You know, we tell the new medics stories about you. Most think they're just that, stories. Daniel's reply was quiet, carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that legends were usually built on the graves of good people. Let them think that. The ones who need to know already do. Then he turned back toward the water. Same calm grip on the rail, eyes focused forward on a horizon that held no answers, only questions. And for the rest of the ride, no one asked who he was again. They already knew. The salt wind carried more than ocean spray. That day, it carried the weight of quiet service, the cost of earned respect, and the reminder that some stories are written in blood and silence, not headlines and parades. It carried the understanding that heroes don't always look like what we expect, that sometimes they look like old men with worn jackets and patient eyes. Because when you've spent your life patching up heroes in places that don't exist, saving lives that can't be counted, carrying secrets that can't be shared, you don't need recognition from everyone, just acknowledgement from those who understand what it really means to serve. Have you ever seen someone dismissed before anyone even asked their name? And if you were standing on that dock, would you have stepped in or stayed silent? If stories like this mean something to you, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Share this video with someone who still believes quiet service deserves loud respect. And as always, we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, here on Graceful Valor Stories.